Hello. Let me read to you from James chapter 2 and verses 5 to 7. Listen, my dear brothers and sisters. Has not God chosen those who are poor in the eyes of the world to be rich in faith and to inherit the kingdom he promised to those who love him? But you have dishonoured the poor. Is it not the rich who are exploiting you? Are they not the ones who are dragging you into court? Are they not the ones who are blaspheming the noble name of him to whom you belong? Now, James is writing to Christian believers from a mainly Jewish background, and the issue of rich and poor was a big division in Jewish culture and society. Jesus' teaching is saturated with teaching about wealth and poverty and warnings about the deceitfulness of wealth. Think of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6, do not store up for yourselves treasure on earth. Or the people Jesus met, the rich young ruler, the widow with her 2 small coins. Or his parables, the rich fool with the overflowing barns, the lost son who squandered his wealth. And maybe most sobering of all, our treatment of the poor and needy now, Jesus says, reflects which kingdom we belong to. And this will be seen at the time of final judgment. The rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16. The beggar sat at his gate and he ignored him. Or the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25. Here are people who are hungry or thirsty, they're strangers, they need clothes, they're sick or in prison. And our treatment of the needy shows, Jesus says, where our hearts are. We can't earn salvation this way, but it is a mark of God's grace. So let's be careful how we think about this. Rich and poor wasn't the only social division in the first century. You read in Paul's letters about that big division between Jews and Gentiles, non-Jews. But certainly in the book of Acts, in the early days of the church, you see that poverty is a real and pressing issue for them. Acts 2 and 4, the believers are all together, and it could be said there were no needy people among them. They shared what they had. In Acts chapter 6, there was a daily distribution of food for the widows. In Acts 11, there's reference to a famine. In Acts 20, Paul says farewell to the Ephesian elders and urges them to remember the weak. He quotes Jesus, it is more blessed to give than to receive. So in James chapter 2, he's already identified the favoritism of verse 1 as people becoming like judges with evil thoughts in verse 4. And now in verses 5 to 7, he gives 2 powerful reasons why this discrimination is so seriously wrong. And the first is this, he says it's ungodly to favour the rich. It's not the way God thinks or acts at all. And James is seeking to be a loving pastor in the way he deals with these people, but he's urgent. He's frustrated perhaps. Listen, he says, my dear brothers and sisters, can't you see what you're doing? This is what he says about God. God has chosen those who are poor in the eyes of the world to be rich in faith and to inherit the kingdom that he promises to those who love him. And you notice this is God's initiative. These are his values. So Christianity is not a celebrity religion. It's for ordinary, everyday people. It's based on different values from the world. And I think you could illustrate that, couldn't you, from the Bible, very simply, the Old Testament. Deuteronomy 7 verse 7, God says to his people, it was not because you were more numerous, stronger, more impressive than all the peoples on the earth. In fact, you were the least, but it was out of love that I chose you. Or Paul writing to the Corinthians, he's very explicit about this. Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose, there it is again, God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. He chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things, the things that are not, to nullify the things that are. And here's the reason, so that no one may boast before him. So it's there in the Bible. I wonder if in reality we could see it today. If we knew who the typical Christian believer is, I think we'd see that it's not the wealthy Western Christian, some kind of favoured few. No, probably the typical Christian comes from the maybe millions in the unnamed, the unnumbered people in the Far East, in the restricted countries, or in the vast cities in South America or in Africa. It's not the rich who are prominent in God's kingdom, it's the poor. Why? Simply because it's God's choice. It demonstrates that it's all grace. Be clear, there's no spiritual virtue in poverty in itself any more than in wealth. But wealth will not bring you closer to God. God does not favour the rich. In fact, he upholds and helps the poor and the needy. But what is James saying to these believers? You have dishonoured the poor. You've done the very opposite of what God does. Even by the way you welcome them, you dismiss them and dishonour them. So stop doing it. And in fact, this whole section from verse 22 in chapter 1 right through to the end of chapter 2 is all about putting your faith into practice. These are the values that God reveals, that Jesus personifies. You say you believe. Now, put into practice what you believe. So the first reason it's ungodly. It's against God and his ways and his values. But the second reason he gives is that it's foolish. Look at the way the rich treat you and the way they treat God. He says, look at the second part of verse 6 and then verse 7. They are exploiting you, they're dragging you into court, and they're blaspheming God's name. Now, we know almost nothing about the specific background or the details of this, but remember already in verses 9 to 11, we've seen that there were the rich and poor within the congregation. If you read on into chapter 4, verses 13 to 16, there were those in the congregation who were making money out of business, and they were self-confident in their planning. We'll go and do this and go there and make money. James says, if God wills, all such boasting, he says, is evil. Or in chapter 5, there were rich landowners who hoarded their wealth. Look at the language there sometimes. They lived in luxury and self-indulgence. How did they do that? Well, they failed to pay the wages of the workers who depended on them. And indeed, we're told they condemned the innocent. Some of these people, the rich, oppressing the poor, were within the congregation. The injustice of the world had come into the church. One final comment. For sure, there are numerous forms of injustice and discrimination in the world today as there were then. But the focus here for James is on the place of money in our lives. I'm not assuming that everybody who listens to this is well off in material things, but many of us are. I know that I am. I wonder what an audit of our finances would reveal about our values and priorities. Where is our treasure? Jesus says where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Well, let me leave you with a couple of questions. There are many that might arise from the passage. The first is this: what kind of power and security does money bring in our culture today? And what dangers does that pose for us as Christians? How can we demonstrate a different attitude to money from the world around us? That's the first question. What kind of power and security does money bring? And the second question about our culture, our society: in what ways are the poor oppressed in our culture today? So what are we doing? What can we do to swim against that tide? And what do we think of those who are poorer than us anyway? What would make poorer people feel truly welcome? So what kind of power and security does money bring, and in what ways are the poor oppressed in our society today?